The life of a serf in medieval Europe, between reality and myth. Medieval Europe, often idealized in novels and films, evokes images of imposing castles, brave knights, and glorious feats. However, this romantic image hides a harsh reality for the majority of the population, the serfs. Far from being the heroes of history, these peasants lived a grim and merciless existence. Bound to the land they cultivated without freedom and trapped in an endless cycle of poverty and suffering, the serfs were the backbone of feudal society, but their lives were marked by hopelessness. From forced labor in the fields to malnutrition, violence, and social restrictions that prevented them from accessing any form of freedom, the serfs lived under a brutal regime that kept them at the margins of any progress or improvement. Through this analysis, we will discover not only the hardships they faced, but also the deep-rooted causes of the social inequality that defined medieval Europe. What was the life of serfs like in the Middle Ages? The condition of serfs in medieval Europe, bound to the land and their fate. Medieval serfs lived in a state of total dependence, essentially tied to the land they worked. Although they were not slaves in the strict sense of the word, their freedom was so limited that the distinction became almost irrelevant. In Latin, they were known as servi, a term that reflected their subordinate position in the feudal social structure. This status not only restricted their movement, but also prevented them from enjoying the rights and freedoms that free men considered fundamental. One of the cruelest features of the feudal system was the inheritance of serfdom status. The children of serfs were also born tied to their parents' land, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and subjugation that seemed to have no end. Without the possibility of changing their fate, serfs were condemned to live and die in the same miserable conditions in which they were born. This inheritance of servitude ensured that the social hierarchy remained intact, with the serfs always at the bottom of the social pyramid. One of the most severe restrictions faced by serfs was the prohibition of leaving their lord's land without permission. This lack of mobility prevented them from seeking work or better opportunities elsewhere. They were entirely subordinated to the will of their lords, who could demand that they work more hours or impose additional tasks without any form of fair compensation. The control over their lives was absolute, as serfs had no political representation or legal voice. In England, serfs were known as villains, and their situation was regulated by what was known as manorial law. Under this system, feudal lords wielded almost absolute power over their serfs, imposing a series of obligations that could not be avoided. The medieval historian William of Malmesbury, who described the living conditions of serfs, highlighted how these men and women were tied to their lands and obligations with no possibility of escape, even in times of great need. In times of poor harvests or famines, the serfs remained responsible for fulfilling the demands of their lords, making their existence even more unbearable. Forced labor in feudalism, the corvée system and its impact on medieval serfs. The life of serfs in the Middle Ages was a routine of unceasing labor, and one of the key characteristics that defined this existence was the corvée, the forced labor they had to perform for their feudal lords. This system forced serfs to dedicate a significant portion of their time working the lord's lands, leaving very little time to meet their own needs or cultivate land for their own subsistence. The corvée was not only exhausting but also used as a tool of control that kept serfs in constant dependence on their lord and the feudal system. Serfs had no choice but to comply with the labor demands imposed by the feudal system. In many cases, this labor was not limited to agricultural work such as sowing and harvesting fields, but also included tasks like construction and maintaining infrastructure. The corvée required serfs to build roads, bridges, castles, and fortifications, elements essential for maintaining feudal power, but offering no personal benefit to the serfs. The constant demand for labor for these projects left serfs with little time to develop their own land, perpetuating their poverty and keeping them trapped in a cycle of exploitation. One of the most revealing documents regarding the structure of forced labor in the Middle Ages is the Domesday Book, a census ordered by King William the Conqueror in 1847-1086. This book details the obligations of the serfs and their contributions to agricultural work, as well as other activities that favored the interests of feudal lords. Through this document, we can see how serfs were required to work not only on their lords' fields, but also carry out repairs or public construction tasks, jobs that provided them with no direct benefits. In many cases, the work they performed not only left them exhausted, but also prevented them from obtaining even the bare necessities for their own survival. The corvée system had not only an impact on the daily lives of the serfs, but also kept them under constant threat. Any attempt to fail in fulfilling labor obligations could result in severe punishment. Feudal lords had the power to impose fines, beatings, or even imprisonment on those who did not meet the labor demands. This punitive structure ensured that serfs remained in their place, subjected to the will of their masters, without any hope for improvement. Forced labor was one of the main ways in which feudal lords consolidated their power. By demanding that serfs work for free and under compulsion, landowners maintained absolute control over the resources and people within their domains. While serfs performed tasks like ploughing, harvesting, and building infrastructure, the lords increased their wealth and secured their position in the feudal hierarchy, without having to worry about wages or working conditions. In this way, forced labor helped reinforce the deep inequalities that characterized the feudal system. Moreover, the labor burdens were so severe that they not only affected the physical health of the serfs, but also prevented them from achieving any prosperity or stability. The time they spent working for their lord was so extensive that they could barely tend to their own fields to sustain their families. Often, personal production was minimal, and living conditions remained in a constant state of deprivation. In some cases, serfs who accumulated wealth or improved their situation through personal effort found themselves trapped once again in the system, as their legal status did not change. This system of forced labor was also essential to maintaining the power structure that existed between the different social classes in medieval society. While feudal lords enjoyed luxury and wealth, serfs, often condemned to endless labor and deplorable living conditions, represented the lowest rung of the social hierarchy. The cycle of work, poverty, and oppression was perpetuated from generation to generation, with no clear way out or possibility for social advancement. Extreme poverty and malnutrition, the reality of medieval serfs. The life of medieval serfs was characterized by extreme poverty, a cycle of constant deprivation that affected every aspect of their existence. Although they were responsible for the agricultural work that supported the entire feudal society, the land allocated to them for cultivation was often insufficient, of poor quality, and in many cases entirely incapable of producing what was necessary to feed their families. This subsistence farming system meant that serfs could only grow what was strictly needed to survive, with no room for prosperity or savings. The amount of land that serfs could dedicate to their own crops varied greatly, depending on the wealth of their lord and local customs. But the general trend was that the majority of fertile land remained under the control of landowners, leaving serfs with minimal portions of land that were of poor productivity. This meant that serfs had to spend endless hours working on their lord's fields, barely having time or resources to work their own plot, which in most cases only produced enough to survive day by day. The quality of the land was also a limiting factor. Often serfs were forced to cultivate on impoverished soils, eroded by generations of relentless exploitation. As a result, their crop yields were low and nutrition insufficient, contributing to the prevalence of chronic malnutrition among the rural population. Poor harvests or bad weather conditions could lead to famine, leaving serfs even more vulnerable to diseases and premature death. The diet of the serfs was basic and lacked essential nutrients. Bread, made primarily from barley or rye, formed the cornerstone of their diet, sometimes accompanied by root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and cabbage. However, access to these foods was limited, and many serfs went hungry for much of the year. Meat, which in feudal societies was a luxury reserved for lords and the nobility, rarely made up part of the serfs' daily diet. On occasion, if the serfs could hunt or fish, they might add some protein to their diet, but this was more the exception than the rule. The chronicler Gerald of Wales, in the 12th century, sadly described the misery of the Welsh peasants, who struggled to survive on the meagre resources the land provided them. In his account, he highlighted the poor agricultural production and how peasant families were almost entirely dependent on what they could cultivate, with no opportunity to acquire additional food. Accounts from this era show how serfs lived in a constant state of hardship, always hoping for a better harvest, but with the threat of food scarcity hanging over their lives like a constant shadow. The extreme poverty of serfs was intrinsically linked to chronic malnutrition. The lack of access to a balanced diet had devastating effects on their health. Diseases such as scurvy, tuberculosis, and various infections were common, as the serfs lacked the essential nutrients to strengthen their immune systems. Physical exhaustion from forced labor, combined with insufficient food, further depleted their stamina and life expectancy. Furthermore, the malnutrition of the serfs not only affected adults, but also had serious consequences for children. Lack of adequate nutrition during the early years of life caused growth deficiencies, weakened cognitive development, and reduced the life expectancy of the peasant population. Epidemics that struck villages, such as the plague or cholera, often caused much higher mortality rates among the serfs than the nobility, due to their deplorable living conditions and lack of medical care. High risk of diseases and injuries. The fragility of medieval serfs. The life of medieval serfs was marked by a constant threat of diseases and injuries, which added to the poverty and labor exploitation they endured. These risks not only worsened the quality of life for peasants, but also significantly reduced their life expectancy. Poor hygiene, extreme poverty, and bad working conditions created an ideal breeding ground for the spread of diseases and workplace accidents. Serfs lived in rudimentary huts, small and typically shared with animals. While this practice helped maintain warmth during the winter, it also contributed to the spread of respiratory diseases. The animals, along with humans, shared the same space, creating an unsanitary environment full of dirt, moisture, and bad odors. The lack of proper ventilation promoted the proliferation of bacteria and fungi, resulting in respiratory illnesses such as pneumonia and tuberculosis, which were common among peasants. Unhealthy conditions also facilitated the spread of parasites and gastrointestinal diseases. Drinking water was scarce and often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid fever. Wounds and cuts, resulting from manual labor in the fields or the construction of infrastructure, were another common source of infections. With no access to medical care and limited resources, these injuries easily became serious health problems. Working in the fields was physically exhausting and dangerous. Serfs were constantly exposed to accidents with agricultural tools, such as plows, sickles, and shovels. Without any form of protection, serfs frequently suffered cuts, bruises, and fractures. Working with animals also carried the risk of injury, as the animals were not always docile and could cause severe accidents. The lack of proper medical care worsened the consequences of injuries. Even minor wounds could turn into serious infections that, without treatment, led to death. Gangrene, for example, was a constant threat, as injuries were not cleaned properly and there were no antibiotics to treat infections. Bone fractures, which could be treated today with a cast and medication, often resulted in permanent mutilation or death from untreated infections in the Middle Ages. Violence and abuse, the unrelenting control over serfs. Violence was a constant in the lives of medieval serfs, used not only as a means of punishment, but also as a way to consolidate and maintain the absolute power of feudal lords. In a system where serfs were considered the property of the land, any attempt at defiance or disobedience was severely punished. Control tactics included physical brutality that was both common and accepted in medieval society. The manorial justice system granted feudal lords the right to impose harsh punishments on the serfs in their domains without the need for intervention from higher authorities. This system ensured that serfs lived under a constant threat of physical retribution. The most common punishments included beatings, floggings, mutilations, and even public executions, which served both as a means of social control and as a warning to those who might consider challenging the established order. Lords and their local representatives had absolute authority over the fate of the serfs. If a peasant was accused of theft or failing to fulfill their duties, the punishment was immediate and often fatal. This systematic violence contributed to the climate of fear that characterized life in medieval Europe, where serfs were not only subjected to harsh working conditions, but also to the constant abuse of those who governed them. One of the most horrific forms of abuse of power was the sexual exploitation of female serfs. In collective imagination, the concept of droit du seigneur, or ius primae noctis, is mentioned, a supposed feudal prerogative that granted lords the right to claim the first night of marriage with a serf's wife. Although the existence of this practice is a subject of historical debate, it is known that the power disparity between lords and serfs created an environment where sexual abuse was a real possibility, even if not necessarily formalized. The vulnerability of women in the feudal system was exacerbated by their economic and social dependence on men, particularly the feudal lord. Often, female serfs had no means of defending themselves against such abuses, and the fear of reprisals kept many silent. History is filled with accounts of women who, despite being trapped in a cycle of exploitation, could not escape due to the strict social norms and restrictions imposed by the feudal system. The marriage of serfs, total control over personal life. In medieval feudal society, the marriage of serfs was not merely a personal act, but a tool of social and economic control. Feudal lords, who already had almost absolute power over their serfs, extended their dominance to one of the most private and essential aspects of human life: family relationships. For serfs, getting married was not just a matter of love or desire, but a decision that had to comply with the strict rules imposed by their lord. Unlike free people, serfs could not marry without the explicit permission of their feudal lord. This control was not only economic, but also social. The lord did not view marriage as a right or a personal choice, but as a means to ensure that the serfs' families continued to work his lands. Thus, permission to marry was a privilege granted only to those who did not threaten the feudal order. This system of control reflected the deep inequality of the medieval system, in which serfs had no power over even the most basic decisions in their lives. Personal autonomy was nullified by the rigid hierarchy, where the lord decided not only the work, but also who could form a family. In addition to permission, serfs had to pay a fee, known as merciless, to obtain the lord's approval to marry. This economic tax represented an additional burden that many serfs could not afford. The merciless varied in amount depending on the lord's property and wealth, but it was generally a significant sum that serfs had to pay simply for the right to start a family. This payment not only limited the freedom of serfs, but also imposed an economic obstacle to fulfilling one of the most human desires, the desire to marry. The merciless was not only an economic barrier, but also another manifestation of the serfs' subordination, as they had to answer to their lord in every aspect of their lives, even in the most intimate. Marriage not only meant forming a family, but also submitting to a system that required payment for the right to do something as basic as living with a partner. The feudal system did not view the marriage of serfs as an issue of individual rights, but as an extension of the lord's control over his land and people. Marriages were regulated not only to ensure the continuous presence of labor on the land, but also to prevent serfs from moving or forming networks of mutual support that might weaken the lord's power structure. In some cases, lords even imposed restrictions on whom serfs could marry. Unions between serfs from different properties or lords could be prohibited or heavily regulated, ensuring that serf families remained within the lord's estate boundaries. In this way, the lord maintained control not only over the land, but also over the social structure that depended on the organization and labor of families. Warriors by obligation, the military role of medieval serfs. In the Middle Ages, serfs did not only work the land. When their lord required it, they became soldiers. This obligation was part of the conditions imposed by the feudal system. Although they were not trained warriors or knights, serfs were expected to fight in times of war, either to defend their lands or to participate in larger military campaigns. The military service of serfs was an extension of their relationship with the feudal lord. In exchange for the protection of their lord, serfs had to offer their labor in times of conflict. Rather than being professional soldiers, serfs were recruited as infantry, often without proper equipment or training. Armed with work tools adapted for combat, such as shovels or axes, they fought on the front lines, facing mortal risks in battles with no formal preparation. During the Crusades, many serfs were forced to march to the Holy Land. In this case, military service not only involved defending local lands, but also participating in a distant religious war. The serfs, though with no real option, joined their lords in a struggle that affected not only their fiefdoms but all of Europe. The Crusades involved long journeys, extreme conditions, and extremely high mortality rates, with serfs receiving no direct benefits or rewards. Serfs who survived the battles returned to their fiefdoms exhausted and often maimed. War, far from being an opportunity to improve their situation, exacerbated their suffering. The shortage of labor, due to the deaths of many serfs, often resulted in greater demands for work from the survivors. For them, war only added to the oppression of a life already marked by poverty and forced labor. The role of serfs as warriors was not something they chose, but an imposition of the feudal system. They were taken to war as an extension of their servitude, with no option to refuse their lord's call. Although in many cases they had no opportunity to escape these obligations, their participation in medieval battles reflects the constant exploitation that characterized their existence. The Black Death and its impact on medieval society. Beyond war. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, left an indelible mark on all aspects of medieval society. However, its impact was not limited to massive mortality, but also deeply altered social and economic structures, including the feudal system and the military capabilities of the time. While armies and knights fought on the battlefield, the plague was undermining the very foundation on which they stood. Serfs, who made up the backbone of the medieval economy, were the most affected by the Black Death. In many cases, peasant populations were decimated, leaving vast stretches of land abandoned and uncultivated. Feudal lords, who relied on serfs to work their lands, saw their workforce drastically reduced. This collapse in agricultural production led to food shortages, increasing poverty and despair among the survivors. The mass mortality also caused a shortage of soldiers. Many of the men who would have been recruited to fight in wars, such as the 100 Years' War, died from the plague or were so weakened that they could not join the fight. This affected military strategies, as armies had to rely on a much smaller workforce and military force. As knights and the nobility succumbed to the plague, military dynamics changed. The need for infantry grew as the casualties among knights and heavily armed men-at-arms were significant. Armies began to rely more on archers and lighter troops. While the use of knights in heavy armor remained essential, military tactics began to adapt, favoring forces that could move more quickly and flexibly. The longbow, like the famous English longbow, became a crucial weapon in battles such as Agincourt, where archers played a decisive role in dismantling heavy knight formations. The conditions for soldiers on the battlefield became even more difficult during and after the epidemic. Diseases, lack of resources, and a shortage of trained soldiers further complicated campaigns. Feudal lords, who had once been able to recruit larger and better prepared armies, now faced the harsh reality that war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also against an unstoppable epidemic. Many soldiers, particularly those in the infantry, fought not only against rival armies but also against disease and malnutrition. Despite these challenges, the feudal system found ways to adapt. The population decline forced lords to offer better conditions to the surviving serfs in an effort to ensure that agricultural production and the workforce could be maintained. Serfs, for their part, seized this opportunity to negotiate better terms and, in some cases, even escape servitude. In the military sphere, changes in strategy and equipment reflected the evolution of tactics as the nobility was forced to reconsider the use of heavy knights and expensive weaponry. War became more accessible for common men who, although not trained as knights, could now participate with more affordable and lethal tools. The Peasants' Rebellion, the cry of desperation against feudalism. The Peasants' Rebellion of 1381, also known as the Wat Tyler Rebellion, was an uprising that marked a turning point in the medieval history of England, reflecting the deep discontent of serfs and peasants towards an oppressive feudal system. This rebellion did not emerge out of nowhere, but was the result of a series of interconnected factors, with the devastation caused by the Black Death of 1348 to 1350 being one of the most significant catalysts. The plague decimated the population, killing about half of the English population, which resulted in an unprecedented labor shortage. The few survivors began to negotiate better working conditions and wages, challenging the established order. However, the feudal lords and the aristocracy, struggling to maintain their vast estates and resources, responded with a series of restrictive laws such as the Statute of Labourers of 1351, which aimed to freeze wages and restrict the mobility of peasants. Additionally, the government of Richard II imposed heavy taxes on the lower classes, such as the poll tax, which increased the burden on the already impoverished population. This combination of economic and political measures, along with the systematic violence and feudal exploitation, overflowed the patience of the peasants. The revolution began as a local uprising in Essex, but it quickly spread, with thousands of peasants marching toward London in search of justice. Wat Tyler, a charismatic leader, emerged as the symbol of resistance against the feudal system and the nobility. The rebel army was not only driven by hunger and suffering, but also by a desire for social equality and the abolition of feudal restrictions. The peasants, armed with rudimentary weapons, took control of London, overwhelming the city and confronting the royal forces. This insurrection was a clear statement that the feudal system, with its hierarchical structure of oppression, was no longer sustainable. Once in London, the rebels demanded immediate and radical reforms. Richard II, a young monarch of only 14 years old, was forced to confront the insurgents. In a tense meeting in Smithfield Square, the king agreed to some of the peasants' demands, such as the abolition of unjust taxes and the removal of certain feudal laws. However, the situation quickly changed when Wat Tyler was killed by a royal advisor during negotiations. This event marked the end of the rebellion, as the rebel leadership collapsed following the death of their leader, and the lack of cohesion allowed the king's followers to crush the uprising with brutal repression. Despite the brutal repression, with thousands of peasants executed and many of the concessions promised by the king being revoked, the peasants' rebellion left an indelible mark on English history. The uprising demonstrated that the feudal society could no longer be sustained as it had been for centuries. The lords, although they succeeded in suppressing the rebellion, realized that the system was in decline. The combination of disease, social uprisings, and economic changes drove the transition from a feudal economy to one more focused on the free labor market, where wage labor replaced the forced labor of serfs. Additionally, the 1381 rebellion was one of the first indications of class consciousness in England. Although the revolt was crushed, it laid the groundwork for future social and labor movements, which would later take shape in movements such as the Lollards and the revolts of the 15th and 16th centuries. It also underscored the decline of feudalism, a system that could no longer adapt to the social, demographic, and economic changes brought about by the plague and the increasing concentration of power in the hands of monarchs. The life of serfs in medieval Europe was one marked by oppression, poverty, and a lack of freedom. Bound to the land, subjected to forced labor, and without rights, they lived in an endless cycle of suffering. Despite their harsh reality, serfs were the foundation of the feudal economy, sustaining a system that kept them on the margins of society. Although their living conditions were ruthless, their history reflects a constant resistance against injustice and inequality, teaching us lessons about the struggle for human dignity and social change.